Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. As all of you would know, President Zelensky has just undertaken a trip to Washington, D.C., where he had a joint press conference with President Biden in person and delivered a major address to a joint sitting of Congress. This will be my breakdown and analysis of that trip, including the things that were announced, the speech itself, its reception, and a lot of the politics around it and where it takes us from here. I'll start with the timing, though. This marks 300 days since Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine. It's impossible not to mark the comparison with day one. At that time, President Biden offered Zelensky asylum in the United States, to which Zelensky offered the immortal response of, "I need ammunition, not a ride." He remained, his inner cabinet remained, and held Kiev. Now, if we think about what would have happened had he left at that time, the Ukrainian people would have felt abandoned. It would have achieved exactly what Russia expected. And the result would likely have been Russia taking over the entirety of the country and the United States and Europe having to fund an insurgency, a government in exile. This whole thing would move on. We wouldn't have had a free and independent Ukraine any longer. Russia would have installed a puppet government, changed its constitution, make Ukraine aligned to Moscow the way Belarus is. Instead, we have a government in Ukraine fighting for Ukraine, along with a committed armed forces that's not only managed to hold against ongoing Russian onslaught, but pushed the Russian armed forces back on the ground in Kharkiv and Kherson and many other places. And this all comes down to Zelensky's personal decision back on the first day not to abandon his people. Now, 300 days ago, no one really expected that Ukraine could possibly be on the brink of driving Russia out of all of its territory, except for perhaps the most optimistic Ukrainians themselves. So the fact that this trip is happening at all, with Zelensky in Washington not as a refugee, but as a wartime leader, is an abject humiliation for the Russians. So just the fact that it's happening at all is a great achievement. Which brings me to the two big things that happened on this trip: Zelensky's speech to Congress and also the face-to-face meeting with President Biden and the subsequent joint press conference. Now, in terms of meaty deliverables, it was that latter case that was more significant. President Biden announced a new package for Ukraine, $1.85 billion for a Patriot missile battery, which I will discuss at length a bit later. There's also $2.2 billion for humanitarian aid and supporting the people of Ukraine through this very cold winter. We saw Zelensky make his efforts in English, where he spoke very well. He responded to questions in Ukrainian, but delivered his remarks in English, which I think was very well received. And there was, of course, a lot of thank yous and congratulations and commitments of ongoing support from both sides. But the most revealing moment was the last question posed by a Ukrainian journalist towards President Biden, saying, look, if everything you're saying in this press conference is true, that America stands shoulder to shoulder, is committed to the very end, is willing to support Ukraine in its struggle for independence until Ukraine decides to open negotiations, if all that's the case, then why don't you give Zelensky everything he actually asked for? Tanks, planes, long-range missiles. Why is everything piecemeal, this carefully calibrated decision of what to provide and what not to provide? And President Biden gave an answer that he doesn't normally give. Normally, it's all about escalation. He says, look, we are not in the fight against Russia itself. NATO isn't fighting Russia. We're happy to support Ukraine in its struggle for independence, but we don't want to escalate things and have a direct war with Russia, essentially. And yet this time, it's not the answer that President Biden gave. Instead, he said that he is holding together a coalition of allies, partners who are providing support to Ukraine through a myriad of ways: money, humanitarian assistance, and military support, and that this coalition would fracture if weapon systems were provided to Ukraine that could be used to attack Russia and potentially escalate things against NATO. Now, he didn't name names, but we can easily deduce who that is. Clearly, it's not the Baltic, it's not Britain, it's not Australia. It's going to be Germany and France. They're the cowards who don't want to provide the weapon systems that might increase somehow risk to themselves in order to help Ukraine liberate their country. It means that Biden is suggesting that America is now ready to provide weapon systems that would be offensive in nature, help take the fight to the Russian army on the ground, but is being held back from doing so by fears of being abandoned by Germany and France and other allies who don't want to go down this path. My own view is that Biden is using allies as political cover a little bit. He has just announced the provision of a Patriot missile battery, something that had been explicitly ruled out months prior as a escalatory risk. So he is providing some piecemeal military platforms, but at the same time is saying, look, we're not going to provide tanks and planes because it could result in escalation, and we're worried that allies might be concerned about that. And I think this is a bit disingenuous. If he wanted to provide the tanks, the planes, the offensive military capabilities, the allies would fall in line. And this is what Germany's approach to the alliance has been. Germany kicks up a stink, but ultimately backs what the United States chooses to do, as it would in this case, particularly given that the outcome is explicit. If Russia pulls out of Ukraine, all territories of Ukraine, then the war would be over. The Americans, nobody else is going to support a punitive military incursion into Russia, and thus the support would end as soon as Vladimir Putin pulls out, something that President Biden said today. So the fact that he is still at this point holding back on providing all the things that Zelensky is asking for suggests to me that he himself is most worried about escalation with Russia. He wants to keep the conflict contained. There's enough problems politically dealing with the Ukraine conflict domestically as it is. He doesn't want to be dragged into a full-scale war with Russia. And he is of a generation that remembers the Cold War and is raised within the Cold War completely. And during the Cold War, American leaders, American policymakers were particularly fearful of nuclear weapons. They were hyper mindful of escalatory risk and not doing things that would unnecessarily provoke the then Soviet Union. So because of President Biden's hyper awareness of the decades of the Cold War, just how close the United States and the Soviet Union came to nuclear conflagration, I think for that reason, Biden is more cautious than perhaps many others would be. And that's a generous kind of perspective on it, that he's just concerned about escalation. He realizes where this could lead. Nevertheless, I think that it can be well communicated to the Russians that the West is going to do whatever it takes to force Russia out of Ukraine, and any escalation, including nuclear escalation, will be fully on the shoulders of Russia, something that I don't believe that the Kremlin is going to be contemplating, given what's at stake in Ukraine for Russia, which is not existential despite what Putin might claim. Now, the address in the joint sitting of Congress, there were three main audiences: the American people, the Russians, and the Ukrainian people. The American people got to hear Zelensky give a full address in English. And not only was it in English, but he delivered it forcefully, articulately, and there were many jokes on social media saying that he speaks better English than Biden, and honestly, I agree. He delivered it in a powerful way, an emotive way, but also a clear and concise way. And so even Zelensky's biggest detractors domestically in the United States had to acknowledge that it was a forceful address delivered in highly articulate English, where he presented as not as a clown, as a comedian, although he did make some funny jokes, but as a committed, determined, and resolute wartime leader. It was the kind of unifying address that America doesn't really hear domestically in the present political environment. And so even those that were critical of Zelensky had to kind of say, well, yeah, it was pretty good though. I wouldn't mind seeing a few more of those speeches from our own political leaders, hence the quips about Biden's English. Second was the Russian audience. Again, Zelensky delivering his speech in English, which would have irked the Kremlin no end. Putin doesn't speak English at all very well. And the extreme warm reception from both parties in the Congress, giving continued standing ovations throughout, ongoing commitment to Ukraine's independence and warfighting. The clear message to Russia is that any idea that the new Congress is going to just abandon Zelensky, abandon Ukraine, that in the new year there's going to be war fatigue, that they're going to stop supporting Ukraine, they're going to put pressure on Ukraine to sue for peace, open negotiations on Russia's terms. All of that is fantasy. It's fantasy. And it's really important to see a speech where Zelensky is standing before the entire Congress, getting rapturous support from the lawmakers in Washington to really drive that point home. Because if you're just listening to the noise, the talking heads, the Tucker Carlsons, etc., if you're in the Kremlin, you might hold out some hope. Be like, look, as things drag on, as things get more expensive, as other things take over the news cycle, then people are going to be like, oh, Ukraine, is that thing still happening? Is it still costing us money? Why isn't Zelensky suing for peace? Well, that's just wishful thinking. And this clearly demonstrates that it's wishful thinking. It closes off even the idea of something that was just a facade in the first place. So with the Russian leadership, it's not enough just for the West to continue to support Ukraine on an ongoing basis and to demonstrate the support to the Ukrainians that, hey, whatever the noise, whatever the politics, don't worry about it. We're going to continue to back you. You have to convince the Russian leadership that that's the case, because people believe what they want to believe. And the Russian leadership wants to believe that as time goes on, as the news cycle moves on, as cost of living continues to go up, the inflation increases, the rest of the world will look at this and be like, why is this war still going on in Ukraine? Why isn't Zelensky sitting down and making a peace deal with Russia on Russia's terms? We can all move on. We can lay down the arms and stop this madness. Well, that's wishful thinking from the Russians' point of view, but wishful thinking is a powerful motivator in times of war. The same thing happened in the Second World War. One of the reasons why the Germans continued to fight right to the streets of Berlin was because there was a belief, a wrong belief, a delusional belief, that the Western allies weren't committed to really fighting to the very end, that they actually were looking for a way out, that the Germans could actually make a peace deal with the Americans, with the British, and in a way that would preserve their independence against the coming Soviet onslaught. Well, that, again, was just completely false, but it wasn't properly conveyed to the German leadership in such a way as to convince them that there was no alternative. In the case of Ukraine and Russia, the Russian leadership wants to believe that as time goes on, support for Ukraine will diminish. And even though all of these things show that that's not the case, it's really critical to demonstrate that. So the visuals of Zelensky presenting himself to Congress, to the American leadership, before the entire world, speaking a wonderful address in English, forcefully talking about victory to the ongoing rapture of everyone present, is a powerful message to the Kremlin. To say, look, you Kremlin idiots, there is no prospect of war fatigue in the West. They are on the winning side. They're going to push Russia out of Ukraine. If you want to save some blood and treasure and perhaps a bit of humiliation, now's the time to pull out. Do I think it'll succeed? No, I think the Russian leadership will launch a major offensive in the spring, but it is part of the whole package to say, look, however much you throw at this, we will throw more. However much you think you're going to break the resolve of the Western allies, we're going to double down and triple down to support Zelensky. And if that message is strong, if it's consistent, if it's backed up with real measures, both symbolic and financial, then eventually that message will sink into the Russian leadership. And of course, for the Ukrainian people, this will be a massive morale boost to see their president, again, not as a refugee, not as someone fleeing the conflict, but they're representing them before not only the United States, but the entire free and Western world, being absolutely supported and know that the rest of the world has their back at a time of enormous struggle. It'll help build a deep reservoir of strength for the Ukrainian people to know that they're not being abandoned, that their plight is being heard, but not only heard, but also admired and respected as they continue to struggle for their freedom, their liberty, and push the Russians back. As for the speech itself, I think it hits a lot of positive notes. Many things I'll say about it that are praiseworthy, and then maybe one or two nitpicks. First, the speech was incredibly forceful. In some ways, Zelensky sounded more a general than he did a president. If you think of the sort of flowery language that presidents use when they go and visit other countries around the world and say, we have no better friend in the world than whatever, they use an anecdote from decades past where they had a close relationship. They'll use a quote from a famous local poet or something like that. And that's the way American scriptwriters tend to work. Whereas Zelensky was blunt. He was on point. He gave his messages forcefully with strong punctuation. And really nailed home that he didn't mince words. He wasn't delivering small talk. He was talking about the struggles that Ukraine was facing. And he did it with warm heartstrings and a few jokes here and there. He talked about Christmas, what Christmas is like in the United States this year as compared to Ukraine. So he drew those pictures and comparisons, but he delivered his message with a certain degree of honesty. And that brings me to the next point. One of the things that people are afraid of is that the money that's going to Ukraine is not being used for its intended purposes, both because they don't trust the Ukrainian government, but also they don't trust their own government. Many people believe that the money going to Ukraine, some of it is going to crypto wallets or whatever, and being funneled back to the Democratic parties for political purposes. Others are just saying that the money is being siphoned off for Swiss bank accounts of Ukrainians' leaders. And he addressed that directly. He said the money is being used responsibly. It's not charity. It's an investment. It's an investment in your own security. We are fighting the war, and we're happy to provide accountability, which is something that the US is currently setting up in Congress. They're setting up a task force for the incoming new House members to become educated on where this money is going. And that is probably a fair criticism. Not that this money is being siphoned off, but that there is an adequate transparency. We are talking huge sums of money, and the American taxpayers do deserve to know that there is oversight and accountability of where the money is going. Is the money actually reaching the people on the ground? Is it helping Ukraine to win this war? Is all the money being donated being accounted for properly and managed and spent efficiently and effectively? Are the tenders and procurements, are they being done on a competitive basis? No one's getting any special treatment. Those kinds of questions are perfectly fair. And one of the timing aspects of this I didn't mention is the omnibus bill. It's a 3,000-page spending bill that will cover all government spending basically between now and October of next year. The new aid package for Ukraine, which totals $45 billion US as part of that, but then half of the omnibus bill is other defense spending, and then all these other programs all in one vote. So many people in Congress are going, how are we even going to read this, let alone get the oversight and accountability that we need? And this speech feeds into that politics, because they say, well, Zelensky is here, he's delivering a speech, and President Biden is trying to manipulate us into voting for a bill that we haven't been able to read because Zelensky's here asking for all this support. And part of this package, but certainly not all, is the aid being provided to Ukraine going forward. So this does have a level of political manipulation where Congress is being asked to vote for a poison pill. They might want to support Ukraine, they might support Zelensky, but in so doing, they're also having to vote on a huge array of unrelated spending, which may or may not be in the interest of their constituents. And just on that thread, before I come back to Zelensky's speech, there are two different critics in the United States, different constituencies, that don't want to continue supporting Ukraine. There's a lot of overlap between them, but there's one group that thinks that the Ukrainian government is no better than the Russian government, that we're dealing with two very corrupt regimes, and that the money that is going to go to Ukraine is going to be wasted no matter what. There's another group that says, yeah, we should support freedom, we should support democracy, and we can be sympathetic to the Ukrainian leadership in their fight for independence, but this is not our money, this is taxpayer money, and taxpayers want money spent on crime, fentanyl abuse, the southern border, all of these other local issues, and they don't want to be continuously being gouged for things that are happening all over the world, many of these things happening very far away, where even the local countries, obviously not the Baltic and Poland, which are giving everything to Ukraine, but Germany and France, who aren't really pulling their weight relative to the United States. Why is it always America who's having to solve all of the world's problems when there are plenty of problems close at home? These are powerful arguments for lawmakers who aren't voted by the citizens of Ukraine. They're voted for by their own constituents. And if those constituents have different concerns, then Ukraine will have to compete with that. So with the recent midterm elections, a number of new Republicans are coming into Congress that bestride both of these groups. Those that are thinking, look, we want to support Ukraine, but we're just worried about the money, we're worried about accountability of transparency. Well, that's where the new groups are being set up to provide that assurance. So everyone kind of generally agrees that, yeah, if we're going to give all this money, we should know where it goes. And in that instance, Zelensky really helped himself in his address to a Congress where he tackled that directly, assuring right down the barrel of the camera, right to everyone there, that the money is being used responsibly. And then there's the other group that says, look, we might sympathize with Ukraine, but is not a core national security interest of the United States. Ukraine is not in NATO, and we have plenty of problems at home. Those people are going to be against it no matter what. But one of the things that makes their life easier is being able to criticize Zelensky and the Ukrainian government for being wasteful, for being corrupt. The fact that Zelensky has come across so strong and honest and a friend of the United States, that takes some of those arguments away from them. And ultimately, as a group on their own, if you can siphon off those that are mostly worried about the transparency aspect, then it's a containable group. The rest of Congress will remain strong, bicameral, bipartisan, resolute behind Zelensky, something that Zelensky expressed both certainty about and gratitude for in his address. Another thing that Zelensky did in his speech that I thought was very clever was talk about the drones that were being built and provided by Iran. Unlike Russia, where some people in the sort of America First circles, there's a constituency in America that says that, look, we could have a better relationship with Russia, we could work with Russia in different ways. Even those people are harsh when it comes to Iran. They're the ones that tore up the nuclear agreement with Iran. They see Iran as a real threat, a big supporter of terrorism, of extremism. And many of those remember the war in Afghanistan, where all of those IED casualties, which made up a huge portion of American casualties in Afghanistan, well, they were all built, manufactured, and shipped from Iran. So there's a strong anti-Iranian sentiment, even among those that otherwise are more sympathetic or at least tolerant of Putin. And so by drawing the fact that Iran is supporting and getting benefit from the war in Ukraine, supporting Putin, that will help undermine the support among those groups as well. They'll be like, oh yeah, Iran is doing these things and perhaps we shouldn't be on their side. The last really good thing that Zelensky did was the way he presented. I mean, he has a background as a comedian and he made a couple of quips in his address, but he didn't present as a clown. He didn't present as someone who you could just write off. He presented as someone very serious, determined, and someone you kind of want in your corner. He seemed like a person that you could depend on and would deliver. If you give him the support that he needs, it's hard to bet against him. You would think that, yeah, he's going to lead Ukraine to victory. So he presented as a very strong leader, something that has been absent not just in our dialogue about Ukraine, but also in our own leadership, to be frank. Do I have any nitpicks? Well, it was a very good speech, but I think it could have been a bit longer. He could have given more examples, personal examples about the struggles that individual Ukrainians had faced and what had been overcome. People in the United States in particular, they're very sentimental and I like hearing individual stories about individual people. And there wasn't really much of that. It was all kind of at the macro level, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's the main themes should be that. But the odd kind of anecdote about the people he met, people struggling in different places, little stories of, young women and older men and things like that, that all goes over very, very well. And if I was reading his speech, I would have said, look, tell us about some of the people you've met. What's really inspired you with the average Ukrainians on the ground and the things that they've dealt with and seen. But that's more of a speech coaching thing and a remark about the way the Americans are. I think also being very specific about what he wanted this Congress to do would have been helpful. He did make remarks about American planes and tanks and things like that, but it was kind of tongue-in-cheek and pointing out that some of the American concerns should be allayed. I thought they were perfectly fine remarks in and of themselves, but he could have said specifically, I want Congress to provide these commitments and this is what they'll get for it. Other than that, again, just nitpicks. The last time that Zelensky addressed Congress, of course, was via video link-up. He provided before and after imagery of Russia's invasion, what Russia had actually done to the place. I think he could have done some of that here as well. But the timing, again, is very strong. Remember, last week there was the FIFA World Cup. The entire world was talking about football, was completely fixated on sport. And Ukraine was knocked firmly off the front page of everything. This going into Christmas puts Ukraine right back on the agenda. It doesn't allow things to move on. With regard to the reception, I think it really did move the needle in a positive direction. Of course, those that were already committed to supporting Ukraine were going to say nice things about Zelensky's speech, but those that were the biggest critics, and I'll put Tucker Carlson at the top of the list. I don't personally dislike Tucker Carlson. I think he represents a segment of the American population that doesn't really get heard otherwise. But his reaction to Zelensky's speech was particularly nasty, and it came across as pretty childish, actually. I honestly don't think that everyone who watches Tucker would agree with him on the way he characterized Zelensky in his speech. In fact, he showed a snippet of Zelensky's speech where I thought, and I think most people watching would see, that Zelensky came out looking pretty damn good, and yet then Tucker went on to give his commentary, his spin on how terrible Zelensky was. I don't think it had that effect at all. He came across as petulant, childish, didn't really have a strong argument. There are others like Matt Walsh, who I also respect. He came out and said that, look, there's been no argument as to why we have to continue to spend billions of dollars supporting Ukraine in this war very far away. He's very much of the, where is it on our list of priorities, national security type deal. I don't think he will be persuaded. But again, his argument was exceptionally weak because, of course, Zelensky presented the arguments for why they were worth supporting. They were defending the free world. If they fall, then Russia's appetite will not be sated. NATO will certainly be next. And given the fact that the Ukrainians are the ones willing to fight and die to support their own freedom, their own liberty, that this is the cheapest way in blood and treasure that the Russian threat can be dealt with. So I think Matt Walsh's argument, the most polite thing that can be said about it, is that it was rather weak. He didn't actually present it, but he did speak to a constituency that is mostly concerned about cost of living, the way government is spending their money, the fact that from their point of view, their own issues and concerns are being ignored or deprioritized, whether it comes to drug addiction or crime or what have you. And so those criticisms were always going to be there. But the fact that these criticisms were made and they didn't come off, they didn't land, is what I'm saying. The Zelensky's presentation was so authentic, so likable, so relatable, and kind of admirable and strong, and look up to him as a leader, that I think that most people watching are not going to be persuaded by these detractors. They look at these criticisms, they weigh it up against the Zelensky that they see, and they go, look, this isn't Hunter Biden, this isn't Sam Bankman. This guy looks authentic. He seems the real deal and is worth backing. And I think he really helped himself in that. He didn't give any extra ammunition to those that were always going to be critical of him, but also helped persuade the middle ground, which I think is a great success. So both the fact that this speech is happening at all, some of the announcements that were made, which I thought were very insightful, and the recommitment, refocus on Ukraine, the demonstration of the entire American political class that they're going to continue to back Ukraine no matter what, I think is an important message for Russia. And finally, I'll end on this, a discussion of the new system that's been announced, the Patriot Air Defense System. This is a system that is capable of shooting down the most advanced Russian aircraft and missiles. It is an incredibly complex system to operate. And when I say incredibly complex, it takes people that are already skilled, engineers, technicians, people who have well-versed in American command and control system. It takes them months of intense training to operate this system effectively. And every battery requires about 90 troops across the entire cycle of its use. So getting Ukrainians up to speed is not going to be an easy challenge. Now, they've proven effective at adapting high-level American systems before, the HIMARS, of course, but this is a whole level above that. This will be a new challenge for trainers to bring Ukrainians up to speed on this system. Now, the justification for providing this system was in response to the infrastructure attacks, the civilian infrastructure from Russian missiles, the electric grid, hospital systems, these sorts of things that are essential and critical for human felicity and life. Well, the truth is these missile systems are not going to be targeting drones. They're probably not going to be targeting Russian missiles either. These missiles cost between $3 and $5 million each. Missiles, not systems, missiles cost that much. They're going to be used primarily for shooting down Russian planes. That's the way it's going to be economically justified, is to shoot down a $40 million fighter jet, not a $10,000 drone. And this had hitherto been one of the concerns about escalation. If Russia's most advanced military aircraft are being shot out of the sky, then everyone would know that the Americans are providing the most high-end military capabilities to Ukraine, and thus could America really be distinct from the war itself? I think these concerns are completely overblown, and that providing Ukraine with whatever it needs to protect its skies is entirely appropriate. Whether or not the training can be done and properly serviced and provided to Ukraine under its control and then effectively employed, that remains to be seen, but I wouldn't bet against them. And yet a single Patriot missile battery, which is what has been announced, will have obviously only limited impact on the battlefield and also be an extremely high value target for Russian armed forces. They'll want to take that thing out. My personal guess is that they're going to be training multiple crews at the same time. And there's nothing announced, and this is my speculation, that they'll be training multiple crews at the same time in order to ensure that, okay, we've implemented one battery. How effective has it been? Should we provide more? If we do provide more, where are the ready-made crews that are capable of operating it from day one? That's probably the way it will go. Certainly, if a number of Patriot missile defense systems are provided to Ukraine's armed forces, that would absolutely be a game changer on the battlefield, because no Russian aircraft that I'm aware of is invulnerable to this system. That it will make air operations, the air superiority that Russia currently enjoys, far more precarious. And then a very last thing, much less sexy, but critically important, is the artillery shells. The aid package from both the United States and a recent one from Britain has mostly gone to artillery. And it's revealing of the position that the European allies were in prior to the war beginning. The Russians have a vast stockpile of artillery shells. They're basically an artillery army. But the West was sort of unprepared for a major land war in Europe. Certainly when the Russians invaded Ukraine, the expectation was that it would mostly be insurgency and guerrilla tactics. They weren't really ready to have major open battles with Russia's armed forces. So these things have had to be produced. And one of the quiet triumphs from the Western allies is be able to get these things into production in such a manner as that they can provide Ukraine's artillery forces with all the shells that it needs to keep fighting, because it is running low. And one of the big blockages that was expected was, hey, are we even going to be able to produce these artillery shells? Well, these problems seem to be resolved. And so if Russia was relying on Ukraine just to run out of bullets, not because the aid wasn't there, but because the factories in production were unable to produce them, well, that's another miscalculation on the Russian side. Overall, a tremendous marker. This will probably be my last video on Baltic World before Christmas. We will have another video at least before the end of the year. But if I don't speak to you before then, please have a safe and happy Christmas for all your loved ones. And of course, spare a thought for those that are not being able to watch YouTube videos that may not even have electricity or heating in east of Ukraine. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe and ciao for now.